Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today is the one Sunday in the entire 3-year lectionary cycle that we read from the book of Esther. So before we talk about the text this morning, I think it's worth taking a minute to fill in the rest of the story. And I'm grateful that Jim started us off with a little intro to what on earth is going on. The book of Esther is a short story, kind of like a novella, about the people of Israel living in the Persian Empire. Remember from this summer, the Babylonian exile and what happens after. The Hebrew people finally come home from their captivity in Babylon, and they must work out how to live a diminished but peaceful existence under Persian rule. So at the beginning of the story, the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus, gets angry at his wife, Queen Vashti, after a multi-month drinking party. He banishes her from the palace, but then he starts to miss having a queen around. So he holds a giant royal year-long beauty pageant to find himself a new queen. The woman that catches his eye is a young Jewish woman named Esther. Esther goes to the palace, becomes the new queen of Persia, but at the advice of her uncle Mordecai, she does not reveal to anyone in her new home that she is a Jew. Mordecai's advice turns out to be good because the king's top advisor, a man named Haman, convinces the king to issue a decree throughout all Persia that the Jewish people should be killed, plundered, annihilated. A refrain that sounds eerily familiar at this point in history. So Mordecai hears about this decree and he goes to the palace to speak with Esther, as we heard in our first reading. He tells Esther that she should go to the king and plead for the lives of her people, ask him to overturn the order. And Esther is hesitant at first. She reminds Mordecai that anyone who comes before the king uninvited risks being put to death. But Mordecai is persistent. And he suggests to Esther that maybe she has been chosen as queen and come into her power in the palace for just such a time as this. So Esther agrees. She dresses herself in her finest and goes into the king's court. Slowly she woos him with beauty, food, and, you guessed it, wine, lots of it, until he promises he will grant her whatever she requests. And it is then, as we heard in this morning's second reading, that Esther reveals to her husband and king, I, your queen Esther, am a Jew. I make a request to you on behalf of my people, save us. Do not annihilate us, let us live. And the king grants Esther's request. He has his murderous advisor Haman put to death, and the Jewish people are saved. Curtain falls, end of story. It has kind of a fairy tale quality to it, doesn't it? Kings, queens, evil advisors, and their ancient schemes. All we are lacking is Robin Williams as a big blue genie. It's a lot like a fairy tale, but it's also a coming out story of sorts. Esther has to make a decision. Will she be herself, her whole self? That might sound like an easy question, but as someone who's gone through the coming out process, I can tell you it's not that simple. There are real risks to showing our whole selves. For Esther, this decision to come out as a Jew is incredibly risky. She might be banned from the palace. She might be targeted by Haman, who's already plotting to kill her uncle Mordecai. If her plan doesn't work to sway the king, she will be killed with the rest of her people. Saying out loud who she is puts everything at risk for Esther. But it is only when she embraces the whole of her identity, when she reveals who she is to those around her, that God can use Esther for salvation. And you know, there's actually two pieces of Esther's identity that are really important here. Two pieces that somehow exist in paradox with one another. Esther is the queen of Persia, and Esther is a Jew. These two things shouldn't be possible at the same time, but both of these pieces of Esther's identity are necessary to save her people. I think that's the enigmatic truth of the story. That there is a vocation in our identity. There's a power in who we are. And if we believe in God's providence and that ever-sustaining power that's caring for us and guiding us in our lives, then perhaps we should consider that God created us, put us in these bodies with these identities for just such a time as this. Our history and our present world are full of people who have learned to harness that power of identity to work for God's purposes in the world. Take Jewish Voices for Peace. It's an organization of Jewish people who advocate at all levels to end the apartheid state in Israel-Palestine. Their advocacy is so powerful precisely because of that shared identity, their Jewish faith and heritage, with the power brokers they were trying to influence, the people of the state of Israel. Or how about Dr. H. Council Trenholm, president of Alabama State University, during the Montgomery bus boycott? He's a bit of an unsung hero. We know the story of Rosa Parks' arrest, don't we? And the bus boycott that followed and changed the course of history. But most of us do not learn another simpler story in the background. The story of a professor named Joanne Robinson at Alabama State University. The night that Rosa Parks was arrested, she grabbed two of her students, ran into the building, and all night long they printed flyers on the university's old mimeograph machine. The next morning, when President Trenholm found out that the school's resources had been used for private and political purposes, 50-some thousand copies, in fact, he called Professor Robinson into his office, sat her down with the intent to fire her. But he listened to her plea, her cause, her explanation. And ultimately, when she was done, he got quiet. And he said, "You must keep fighting for civil rights." She kept her job, and she kept using the copier for flyers. We hardly consider Dr. Trenholm a civil rights hero, but he was a man with authority, an open mind, and a mimeograph machine for just such a time as this. In a few weeks, our church will kick off our annual stewardship season. Get excited. That time each year when we consider the mission and ministry of this church, consider the money in our own pockets, and consider how we can give to keep that ministry going. It always goes about the same. Those with a little money give a little bit, and those with a lot give a lot. And together, our gifts, big and small, make our ministry possible. It's a rhythm that's familiar to most of us who have grown up in the church. We piece together what we have to make something bigger than any of us could have done on our own. We entrust our financial gifts and resources to God, proclaiming in faith that every good gift comes from God, and that our treasures were never really ours to begin with. Stewardship is what we call it. We are simply stewards of what we have. And now money is important, of course. It is the currency that makes our ministry possible. Everything from keeping the lights on to building roofs to stocking the shelves at shared table. But I think we often make a mistake when we limit this conversation about stewardship to just a conversation about money. Esther won't let us do that. We have much to give, she says. Our time and our talents, yes, but Esther pushes us even beyond that. She says, you are stewards of all that God has given you. Stewards of your identity. Give what you have to God, yes, but give who you are to God. God has created us delightfully and perplexingly unique. We've had different experiences, made different mistakes, learned different lessons. We know different people, we have different skills and passions. And each of us has an ability to work for God's kingdom in a way that no one else on earth can do quite the same. Maybe it was meant that way for just such a time as this. So friends, who are you? Are you male, female? Are you old? Are you young? Are you a doctor? Are you a cook? Are you a teacher, a sales clerk, a custodian? Are you thin? Are you fat? Are you tall? Are you short? Are you gay? Are you straight? Do you like outdoors? Do you like indoors? Do you make doors? Are you a recovering alcoholic or addict? Do you know and love someone who suffers from an eating disorder or who has experienced homelessness? Are you a teacher? Are you an immigrant? Are you unemployed? Do you care for someone living with dementia? Do you have children? Do you have cancer? Is it possible that God can use even these pieces of us in the world? Friends, there is power in who we are, in what we've been through, and what we've learned. All of these identities and experiences, they make us unique and therefore uniquely useful to God. And just like with our pledge cards and the offering plate, when we cobble all of these people and experiences together, somehow we always seem to end up with exactly what we need. God's people in this world are beautifully diverse. God's people in this particular church right here, right now, are beautifully diverse. And perhaps, if Esther is right, God has created us, shaped us, molded us, and brought us together here in this place, in this way, for just such a time as this.